Keanu Reeves returned home after a long day at work. He felt the fatigue tighten his body, but the desire to relax and spend time outdoors overcame him. He headed to the backyard where his pool was waiting. The evening was quiet, the light softer and warmer, and everything seemed peaceful, perfect for unwinding and cooling off in the water. He took off his shoes and was about to step toward the pool when his gaze fell to the ground. Footprints. Strange, clearly left recently. Light, but leading forward. Someone had passed through his yard. Keanu froze, narrowing his eyes. He carefully watched the tracks which led to the fence and disappeared into the bushes. He felt his calmness fade, and anxiety slowly began to take over. An unknown person. Someone could have been here just moments ago. Keanu suddenly felt something tighten inside. His thoughts slid to the obvious. It's a thief. But why hadn't he noticed it before? Suddenly, everything seemed suspicious. The past nights, strange sounds he had ignored, the days when he had left, and the house left alone. He decided to check the security camera footage, but something in his intuition told him that something important was still unsolved. Keanu grabbed his phone and checked the security footage. At first, he saw minor movements in his yard, but the more he scrolled, the clearer his unease became. He noticed the camera had picked up strange silhouettes a few times, flickering in the dark corners of his yard. It was obvious someone had been watching him for a while, choosing moments when he wasn't home to sneak in. His chest tightened. This couldn't be. Who was this person? He got lost in his thoughts. The answers weren't coming, but the question remained. Keanu realized he had to confront this. Time passed and his anxiety grew. Unexpected events overwhelmed him, and the thoughts that his life had become someone else's game haunted him. Every glance at the camera and every step he took at home seemed more significant than ever. But now he had a goal, to find the one who was following him before they had a chance to steal anything. At that moment, Keanu noticed something important. He looked again at the footprints leading to the fence. These weren't random. He couldn't quite say what it was, but they weren't leading nowhere. They led to an old shed in the backyard. A flash of thought crossed his mind. This could be an entrance or an open access point. It was strange because the shed had been unused for years, and no one should have known about its existence. This was the moment of truth. Keanu approached the shed. The door was slightly open. The darkness inside was impenetrable, but he felt a shadow flicker within. And then his realization became clear. He was trapped. Not knowing what to do, he stepped fully inside, ready to face whoever had been following him. And at that moment, the door slammed shut behind him with a foreboding sound. Keanu had returned home after a long day. His thoughts were burdened with the need to rest, but the idea of relaxing in the pool kept him going. All he needed now was to give his body and mind a little break. The evening was quiet, warm, with no wind or clouds. It seemed like the whole world had stopped, giving him some time for himself. But as soon as he approached the pool, his gaze fell on the ground. There, among the stones and tiles, were footprints. Keanu froze. They led straight to the fence and disappeared into the dark bushes. The tracks were fresh, but not too obvious. It was strange. Keanu stepped closer, and his heart slowed slightly. He didn't know what should have happened, but his intuition told him that someone had been here recently, and these tracks had been left by someone who was too careful to be noticed. This wasn't a coincidence. His mind processed this as a loud signal, his body responding with an unclear but definite reaction. He couldn't explain why, but something about this became the first sign that his life was changing. Keanu stood still for a few minutes, unsure of what to do next. He fumbled with a stone in his hands, trying to calm himself. He couldn't understand why this unsettled him so much. He had been through many unusual situations, but this one felt different. All the sounds he once dismissed were now off. He looked around. The yard seemed empty and safe, with no signs that anyone was actually watching him. Nevertheless, the tension inside him continued to rise. Why did he feel so vulnerable? The footprints could have been random, of course, but his mind couldn't shake the thought that there was something more behind them. He returned inside and closed the door behind him. His hands trembled slightly as he disabled the security system and checked the surveillance camera. He knew this was his last chance to find any answers. Everything that had happened felt too real to just stand idly by. He selected the camera footage from the yard and began scrolling through the recordings. At first, there was nothing unusual. The usual movements, his walks around the property, evening activities. But then, on one of the frames taken late at night, he noticed a figure, a silhouette that disappeared too quickly around the corner. The camera hadn't captured it clearly, but Keanu knew this was no random passerby. He went back to the very footprints he had seen near the pool. Everything appeared ordinary, no signs of forced entry, no destruction. He began examining the area from a different angle, analyzing each element. His steps were cautious, like someone who feels vulnerable in a familiar setting. He checked the door and windows. Everything seemed in order. The cameras again showed an empty scene, but there was something unsettling in the silence. Keanu continued to stare at the footprints, and as it often happens in films, the more he tried to make sense of it, the less it seemed to add up. Eventually, the footprints led deeper into the garden and disappeared near an old shed. The shed had always been part of his life, but he had never paid it much attention. There were many other objects in the yard that caught his focus, but the shed remained forgotten. However, now it was significant, and the tracks led to it. As Keanu approached the shed, his intuition told him not to open the door immediately. He needed to check everything. The door was slightly ajar, and the shadow within seemed alien to him. Keanu felt his heart beat faster. He wasn't ready to face what might be inside, but at that moment he realized that avoiding it was no longer an option. In what felt like slow motion, Keanu cautiously pushed the door open, and it creaked. Inside was darkness, but Keanu felt a chill run through his body. He turned on the light, and his eyes quickly adjusted to the surroundings. Yet nothing unusual was inside the shed. Everything looked the same as always. Old furniture, boxes, a few tools, everything as usual. But something didn't sit right. Suddenly his gaze fell on a small detail that he couldn't immediately explain. On one of the shelves was an old book, but it hadn't been there before. He approached carefully and noticed that it was slightly open. Keanu picked it up. The pages were yellowed, and on one of them lay a note. The words on the paper were written in a hurried, messy handwriting. "You are not alone. We are watching you." It was as if the world around him froze in that moment. Keanu felt his hand begin to sweat. Who could have left this message? And more importantly, why? Keanu returned to the house, still holding the book. He felt the need to figure this out and quickly went back to the camera recordings. He began reviewing old footage, unaware of how time was passing. A few recordings didn't offer clear answers, but one caught his attention. It was the evening when he returned from work, and the camera recorded a movement at the exact moment he entered his house. He watched the footage again and again, trying to make sense of what was hidden in that frame. But no detail surprised him as much as the face of the person who briefly appeared on the recording. It was blurry, but Keanu knew who it was. It was someone from his past. He remembered them but couldn't quite recall where or when. The one who had been watching him wasn't a stranger. They were part of something much bigger and long forgotten. Keanu felt a rising sense of fear in his soul. Everything was connected to his return, and now he was on the verge of discovering what it all meant. The more Keanu thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't get out of this situation without confronting it. His life had become part of someone else's plan, and now he had to find out what was behind it. It wasn't just a breach. It was manipulation, using him as a pawn. But what happened next? He looked again at the book in his hands, and its pages began to unfold before him, a picture he didn't want to see. With every passing moment, things became clearer, and he realized that this was just the beginning. Keanu sat in his office, losing track of time. As he flipped through old documents, his eyes stopped on a photograph. He couldn't understand why this particular photo made him feel so uneasy. He looked at the image, and his eyes blurred with something hazy. In the picture was a group of people, but one of them seemed out of place. It was a face he couldn't remember, but one he somehow felt. Why couldn't this face just be familiar? Why did it radiate such a strange aura? His mind slid back to the recent past, to the moment when he had just returned home and noticed the tracks in his yard. He recalled how, at that time, his intuition had immediately told him that someone had been nearby. Keanu felt the tension in his body return. He stood up, deciding to check the security camera again. He knew someone had been watching him, someone who had been following him for a long time. He could no longer sit idly by, knowing his life had become part of something he couldn't control. He switched on the monitor again. He scrolled through the footage from the yard camera. His heart began to race when a familiar face briefly flashed on the screen. Unclear, almost blurry, but Keanu knew who it was. It was the face from the photograph. But it wasn't just a random glance. This was the person who had been stalking him. Keanu could no longer sit still, and as his mind began to piece things together, his thoughts grew more and more unsettled. He knew he couldn't leave this unresolved. He could no longer ignore the fact that someone was following him. Who was this person? How had they entered his life? He walked through the yard again, checking every corner, inspecting every detail. The tracks leading to the shed were no longer just marks in the ground. They had become part of this unsolved mystery, part of his life, which he had thought he controlled. How long had this person been watching him? Keanu realized that his life had likely been under surveillance for some time. He went back inside, made a decision, and went to his phone. The numbers he called. These people had long been part of his past, but he could no longer rely on their help. After all, this was something bigger than just footprints. He couldn't trust others anymore. This was his matter. He had to find the answers. He stood in his office and once again glanced at the old photograph. He focused on the person in the picture, the face that seemed familiar. Who are you? He thought, feeling that name occupy more and more of his thoughts. Suddenly he realized he had met this person before. But where? And why did their face remain so vivid even though he couldn't remember who they were? Keanu felt his mind begin to unravel. His breathing quickened and his fingers nervously fidgeted. Suddenly, everything that had happened didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. He remembered everything. He remembered how he had once met this person when he was younger, how they had stood in the shadows and watched him. They hadn't exchanged a word, but it had been a strange, tense feeling that Keanu couldn't forget. As this thought settled in his mind, it spun him around. At that moment, Keanu realized that his life was no longer his own. He had become part of something far more complicated than he could ever imagine. This person wasn't a random observer. They were part of a plan where Keanu was nothing more than a pawn, and now everything had been decided. But even in that moment, as his realization took hold, Keanu couldn't just give in. He was ready. He was ready to break free from this trap and find answers. But for that, he needed to take the final step, the step that would bring him face to face with the true stalker. Keanu returned to the backyard. He knew this place was not random. He approached the shed, which had been at the center of all these strange events. He felt the shadows around him grow thicker. He was no longer someone who simply ignored risk. He was ready to search, ready to confront whoever was behind this. With every step, the tension grew. As he approached the shed, he felt time slow down. What had once been part of the night's atmosphere now felt alive. The shed was no longer just an empty site. It had become a symbol of what he needed to find and what he needed to uncover. Keanu listened intently. The rustling from inside the shed made him stop. He opened the door. Something shifted in the darkness. He knew something was hidden within those walls. As soon as he opened the door, it was darker inside than it had been outside. He turned on his flashlight and felt his whole body tense. He directed the beam of light into the room, and as soon as the light touched the far corner, his eyes met the figure he had been searching for. A shape, hidden in the dark, stepped forward. "You finally came," said the stranger, his voice cold and confident. Keanu felt his heart skip a beat. He already knew who was standing before him, and everything he saw now became part of this unfamiliar, frightening reality. His life was no longer his own. "Why have you been following me?" Keanu asked, although he knew there was no answer that would satisfy him. The stranger smirked, but there was no joy in his eyes. "You were part of the plan from the very beginning. Your life, your steps, they were all calculated, Keanu." As the stranger stepped aside, Keanu felt his breath grow heavy. He was ready, but everything he heard gave him no clarity. This person was part of his life, part of the very game he couldn't understand. But now, standing before him, Keanu realized his life was no longer someone else's game. He took a step forward. "I won't be part of this," he said. "I decide how my life ends." The stranger fell silent. At that moment, Keanu felt his life fill with meaning once again. He was no longer a pawn. Now everything depended on him. Keanu slowly approached the shed, feeling his body tense with every step. His mind raced with thousands of thoughts, but none of them could calm him. The shed wasn't just a building. It was a place full of uncertainty. And no matter how hard he tried, he knew the answers to all his questions lay there. He remembered all the suspicions, all the strange occurrences he had experienced in the past few days, the footprints, the camera, the stranger. It had all led him here. He touched the doorknob, and before opening it, he looked around once more. Darkness enveloped him, but his eyes were blinded by obstacles, and despite his hesitation, he stepped inside. As soon as the door creaked, his breath grew heavy. The shed was silent, broken only by the sound of his normal footsteps. He couldn't understand what he was looking for, but he was sure it was something important. His hand reached for the light switch, and as soon as the beam cut through the darkness, Keanu froze. Before him lay 10 old boxes covered in dust. Forgotten furniture stood in a corner, and on the shelves were tools long unused. Everything looked ordinary, but something unsettled him. It wasn't just a shed. It was a place where he felt his life was finally facing the inevitable, where shadows would no longer be just shadows. Keanu walked through the dark room, his steps echoing in the emptiness. He looked around again, listening to the silence. Had this place always been like this? Had his perception changed? Suddenly, his gaze fell on one of the corners of the shed, where an old shelf stood. On it was a book, or rather, its cover. This wasn't an ordinary book, nor one that could have been found on the shelf by chance. It was something that couldn't just be left there. As Keanu approached, his fingers brushed the cracked cover. Suddenly, his heart clenched. Inside the book was nothing but his name. He pulled it from the shelf, struggling to open the heavy pages. He felt something strange and inexplicable weigh down on his shoulders. This wasn't an ordinary book. It was something much more sinister. He opened the first page and immediately read something that made his heart stop. The words were written in a hasty, careless hand. "You are not alone. We are watching you. You were chosen, and you cannot escape this path." Keanu felt his chest fill with a sense of atmosphere. He couldn't understand why this note affected him so much. He asked himself who could have written it, and what did it mean? He turned the page, and the words only grew darker, more ominous. "All your steps have been read. You cannot avoid your fate. We have been watching you from the very beginning." It wasn't just text. It was a warning, and Keanu realized he was part of something much bigger than he had imagined. He felt a chill sweep through his body. Keanu understood that he could no longer remain ignorant. He was trapped. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was the result of a carefully planned game. He didn't know who was behind it all, but one thing was clear. His life was part of a much larger, more sinister plot. He looked around the shed again. Something clicked in his mind. There had been moments in his life when he felt someone was watching him, but now he realized that this was more than just a feeling. His life had been entirely calculated by someone else. It was as if every step he took had been guided, and at some point, it was all supposed to lead to this place. His hands trembled as he began to inspect the other items in the shed, thinking they might be the key to the puzzle. Every box, every item now seemed part of this grand plan. He could feel the walls of the shed closing in on him. Every detail he saw confirmed his worst fears. He was trapped. Keanu began searching for an exit. He had to find out who was behind this and what was hidden in the shed. His gaze fell once again on the book. He opened it again and began flipping through the pages. Suddenly, he came across a page that read, "You are not alone. You were chosen. And now you must understand that you decide how to end this game." The words on the page made Keanu freeze. He felt his heart beat faster. This wasn't just a letter. It was a challenge. Who was this "we" who had been watching him? What did they mean by, "You must understand"? The answers he sought were now becoming increasingly unclear, but one thought began to crystallize in Keanu's mind. This wasn't just a game. It was something far more dangerous. He closed the book, but his mind kept racing. Keanu wasn't ready to admit that his life was part of someone else's plan, but now he couldn't ignore the fact any longer. He was no longer just a person who had ended up here by chance. He was a pawn in someone else's game. Keanu surveyed the shed, and his gaze stopped on the old shelves with tools. In one swift motion, he began checking everything on those shelves, soon finding a metal box. It was heavy and sealed. At first glance, it wasn't clear what was inside, but something in his intuition told him that this was part of the solution. He opened the box. Inside was an old sealed envelope with his name on it. Keanu carefully opened it and read aloud, "Your life is no longer your own. You've been part of this plan from the very beginning." These words clouded his mind. Everything became clear. This was all part of a much larger network, where he was nothing more than a pawn. When Keanu turned again, he felt something flicker behind him. He spun around and saw a silhouette standing in the darkness. The shadow wasn't just a shadow. It was a person, the one who had been watching him, the one behind it all. "Are you ready to understand what's happened?" the stranger asked, his voice calm but completely laced with threat. Keanu felt a chill run through his body. This was the moment that changed everything. He knew his life no longer belonged to him. He was part of something much bigger. But he also knew that only he could decide how to end his story. "I can't let this continue," Keanu said, his voice firm and full of resolve. "I decide how to end my life." He stepped forward, and his eyes met those of the one standing before him. Keanu was no longer the one who gave in. He was ready to face the one who had manipulated his life and understood what would come next. In the stillness of the night, Keanu felt his heart beating faster. He stood before the stranger, his eyes unable to look away from the face hidden in the dark. Suddenly, everything in his life, which had seemed normal and familiar, turned out to be part of someone else's game. The fear that had paralyzed his body had become reality. This encounter wasn't a coincidence. It had been predicted long ago. There had been no step in his life that hadn't been calculated. "You don't know who's behind this, do you?" the stranger asked, his voice cold but filled with certainty. Keanu felt his shoulders relax, and this question made him pause once again. Who is he? Keanu began to realize that the answers he had been searching for were finally starting to come together. At that moment, when he understood he had been part of something much larger, it didn't just shake him, It completely shattered his perception of everything. This was not a random choice, not an error, not a coincidence. Everything that had been happening was part of something bigger, and now, standing before this stranger, Keanu felt his world collapsing. His life was no longer his own. Each word from the stranger pierced him like a knife, causing him to lose confidence. He was ready to fight, but now he needed to find the strength not to give in. This was not just a confrontation with reality, but with his very essence. Keanu tried to stay calm, but memories rushed back. Memories of how his life had become something controlled, alien. He remembered everything. The meetings, the people, the strange coincidences that had seemed so ordinary. But now he realized that they were all part of a carefully crafted plan. "You were prepared from the very beginning," the stranger continued. "Your life was planned and calculated. You are just a link in this chain." These words made Keanu feel vulnerable, but at the same time significant. He could no longer hear the truth. He needed to understand who controlled his fate. At that moment, Keanu realized that his fear was not just a defense mechanism, a signal he could no longer control. He was part of something that went beyond his own perception, and he needed to figure out how to take control of it. Keanu felt his inner world begin to tighten. He was no longer sure that everything that had happened to him was random. Now, every step he took, every action he made, seemed part of this plan. Thoughts raced through his head, and one led him to an important realization. He could not let his life continue to be controlled by this force. "You're wrong," Keanu said, his voice firm, though inside he still fought. He tried to maintain his confidence, but inside, it was clear now that he had to take decisive action. "I decide how my life will continue." The stranger stood before him, his eyes hidden in shadow, but Keanu felt he had become a different person. He was no longer the one who gave in. Now he was the one ready to fight for his life. This determination filled him from within, and Keanu knew he wouldn't turn back. He stepped forward despite the offers, despite the fear. His hands were sweating, his body tense, but his spirit was ready. His inner voice told him that if he didn't take this step, he would lose the chance to change his fate. This wasn't just a fight for his life, but for his freedom. Keanu began to remember moments from the past, the people he had met, the words he had heard, but ignored. Now all of these memories became part of the bigger picture. He remembered the encounters with people who had seemed like random acquaintances, but now he realized they weren't just coincidences. His life had been part of this game, and he wasn't just a random observer. He was part of the mechanism that had driven him forward. "You still don't understand," the stranger said, his words full of disappointment. "You were never free, Keanu. Your decisions were never yours." Keanu stopped, feeling his mind start to clear. He had been part of the plan, but he was no longer ready to be a passive player. In that moment, he realized he was ready to accept this challenge. He had to take back control, and if that meant fighting, he was ready. Keanu could not leave his thoughts behind. He stood before the stranger, and now, realizing that every step he took was not just a choice, but part of a larger scheme. He understood that his choice had always been in his hands. This man, the stranger, tried to convince him that he was part of something beyond control. But now Keanu understood that his life had always been his own. "I don't believe you," he said, his voice firm as his eyes met the stranger's. "I decide how my life will unfold." These words weren't just statements. They were a new reality for him. He realized that it didn't matter how many people had been watching him or who had tried to manipulate his life. He was the one who could change its course. "You won't beat me," the stranger said with desperate confidence. He stepped closer, but Keanu didn't back down. His eyes didn't flinch. He knew that all along this had been someone else's game, but now it was time for him to decide how this story would end. "You're wrong," Keanu replied, his voice filled with determination. He knew that only he could stop this game. He was no longer the one who gave in. He was the one who would now fight for his freedom. The stranger, sensing Keanu's resolve, froze. He understood that this man could not be broken, and his eyes narrowed. He had become part of something bigger than just a trap. In that moment, Keanu realized that everything now depended on him. He took a step forward, ignoring the threat, ignoring his fear. Everything that had happened up to this point had brought him to the place where he could decide his own fate. "You won't beat me," Keanu said with absolute certainty as his steps grew more confident. At that moment, he understood that he was no longer part of someone else's game. Now, he was the master of his own destiny. The stranger stepped back, his eyes full of disappointment. Keanu felt again how the freedom he had been seeking for so long was now in his hands. He was no longer an observer. He was the one who could change everything. "Now I decide," Keanu said, his gaze unwavering. He was no longer just a player in someone else's game. He was the one who could create his own reality, and with the final step, he felt his life begin to change. In that moment, Keanu realized that no matter how many people had tried to manipulate his fate, he now decided what would come next. The darkness thickened around Keanu as he continued through his house, but something in his chest tightened. Every action, every step he took, now seemed part of a more sinister plan. He knew he couldn't stop. He had to act. The entire house had become a trap to him, and he couldn't allow himself to be a prisoner of pure doubt and fear. The footprints, the camera, that mysterious face, it all pointed to the fact that his life was no longer in his hands. Yet, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. Every movement now came with an unsettling sense of dread. He thought about how his steps quickened, and his thoughts became chaotic. When he reached the room where the old books and documents were kept, his gaze immediately fell on something strange. A book that had previously gone unnoticed lay exposed. But this wasn't just any book. This was the book that turned out to be the key to understanding what was happening. He picked it up and began flipping through the pages, stopping on certain phrases. These were notes, written hastily, yet they kept him on edge. "You can't shut yourself off. You've always been part of this." These lines weren't just a warning. They were part of something far more complex than he had imagined. Everything that had happened in his life could have been part of a game he couldn't win. "This is impossible," he said aloud, feeling his fingers begin to tremble. Keanu realized he needed to do something, but he couldn't understand how. He was part of something far more powerful than he had imagined. In his hands was a book full of riddles and strange predictions, and Keanu suddenly realized this was the moment of truth. He wasn't a random participant in the game. He was a pawn in someone else's hands. He felt his inner world begin to rush. Everything he had considered reality now seemed like a lie. Keanu started flipping the pages faster, trying to find something that would explain what was happening. But all he found only confused him further. Every note was a memorable warning that none of this was random, but part of a long-term plan. And he was just a part of it. His life had been part of the game, and now he had to decide how to play it. As soon as Keanu placed the book on the table, a strange sound caught his attention. It was unclear, like something moving in the dark. He froze, listening, and for a moment, his gaze drifted toward the window. He couldn't tell what it was, but the feeling was horribly familiar. He wasn't alone again. He couldn't take his eyes off the shadow he saw from a distance. This wasn't some random moment, the one he had been waiting for and couldn't just ignore. Keanu quickly turned off the light and quietly approached the window. His fingers touched the cold glass. He was ready. Everything that had happened up to this point didn't matter. He had to see who was behind it. He needed to understand what was behind the stalking that had accompanied his life. In that moment, he realized it didn't matter how much time had passed. All that needed to be done now was to face the one who had caused his fears. He saw him, the silhouette standing in the shadow near his house. He couldn't tell exactly who it was, but he knew it was the one he had been looking for. His breathing became labored, thoughts tangled. He wasn't ready for this moment, but he knew there was no turning back. Keanu knew that now he was no longer a victim. He was ready to act. He opened the door and stepped into the darkness, despite the feeling of fear that gripped him. The shadow moved so quickly it was impossible to tell who it was. But as he got closer, his eyes slid over the figure in the dark. It was a face he had already seen, but couldn't remember from where. Suddenly, his intuition told him this wasn't just a coincidence. This person was the one who had been following him. And Keanu knew this moment was decisive. "You came," the stranger said, his voice quiet and deep. "You came to learn the truth." Keanu felt the fear squeeze in his chest, but still he was resolute. He took a step forward. "I came to understand who you are and why you've been following me." The stranger smirked, his face hidden in the shadow, and Keanu couldn't make out what had happened before his eyes, but he felt the chilling cold of this person pierce him to his bones. "You think you control your life, but you're just a pawn in someone else's game," the stranger said, his voice dripping with indifference. Keanu felt his body tense. This wasn't just a game. It was something more. "I decide how my life will continue," Keanu replied with a confident gaze, but even he couldn't hide the way this moment made him feel. He wasn't ready to be under control. Everything he did was his choice. He could change everything. "You can't beat me," the stranger said, his voice full of confidence. But Keanu knew it was a lie. He wasn't the pawn to be moved. He was ready to fight. He took a step forward, feeling the power of determination contradict him. It didn't matter who stood in front of him. It didn't matter what happened. Now he was the one who controlled the electricity. "You still don't understand," the stranger continued, his eyes glinting in the dark. "You were chosen for this game. You can't choose." But now Keanu knew it wasn't true. He was ready. He couldn't stay a passive assistant in someone else's game. He could choose his own path. Keanu took a step toward the stranger, his confidence clear. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. This moment was decisive. Everything he had been through had led him here. He was breaking all ties with the one behind this game. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "I decide how this story ends." The stranger froze, his eyes narrowing. Keanu felt his resolve solidify. He was ready to face the one who had controlled his life. This moment was the climax. This was the end of the game. Keanu looked at the stranger with cold determination. At that moment, his world changed. He was no longer just part of someone else's game. He was a free man. He could choose. "Now I decide what happens next," Keanu said, and his voice sounded like a verdict. The stranger was no longer a threat. Keanu was ready to start a new chapter of his life without looking back. When the stranger disappeared into the darkness, Keanu understood that his fate was now in his hands. He could move forward, no longer looking back. He was ready to decide his own destiny. Keanu stood before the stranger, realizing that everything happening wasn't a coincidence. He understood that his life wasn't his own, but part of someone else's plan. But this was not the end. He was ready to fight for himself, for his freedom. "You thought your life was your own," the stranger said. "You were always part of the game." Keanu realized this was the moment of truth. He couldn't give up. "I decide how it goes from here," he said. The stranger said Keanu was part of the plan from the start. But Keanu realized he wasn't a pawn. He could change the course of events. "You can't control me," he replied. "I decide how to end my life." At this moment, Keanu realized the choice was his. He was no longer part of someone else's game. He was ready to change his fate. "I won't take part in your games," he said, stepping forward. Keanu stood before the stranger, knowing every step he took had been calculated. But now he was in the same position. He was the master of his fate. You were part of the plan, the stranger said. No way out. I decide how it goes from here, Keanu replied, feeling the strength of his resolve. You can't beat me, the stranger said, trying to convince Keanu of his weakness. You're wrong, Keanu said. I won't play this game anymore. You've lost, Keanu said, his voice full of confidence. Now I control my life. The stranger froze, stunned by Keanu's strength. Keanu glanced at the stranger one last time and understood he was free. Now I can live my life, he said, taking a step forward.